incompetence as evidenced by the periodic mutinies in the army, but compared to what had come before and what was going to come after, the mid to late 220s AD was pretty much heaven on earth. Taxes were low, the frontiers were quiet, and the imperial regime was stable. That period of relative calm, however, is about to come to an abrupt end. In 230 AD, the new Sassanid king Ardashir, who we introduced last week, made the bold decision to begin attacking the Roman Empire. He was an aggressive and ambitious leader, and it is reported that his ultimate objective may have been to completely dislodge the Romans from the east, which was an aggressive and ambitious goal to say the least. He amassed an army on the banks of the Tigris River, which at the time had been serving as the de facto Roman-Parthian border, and began raiding the Roman positions in Mesopotamia. At the very least, Ardashir planned to reclaim this critical region, which had again fallen under Roman control during the reign of Caracalla. Ardashir's raids sent alarm bells ringing across the empire, as observers of Eastern politics knew that Ardashir and the Sassanids were a dangerous new power looking to make their mark on the world. Despite calls for him to immediately order a counterattack, Alexander responded, not unreasonably, by sending envoys to Ardashir to figure out what was going on. He was castigated for this timid response by many in the legions, who accused Alexander of being a decadent coward, afraid of fighting. But Alexander wanted to be sure this wasn't all some misunderstanding before he started a war. Trying to end conflicts with words rather than swords is not a terrible policy. As the oft-cited Winston Churchill quote goes, "To jaw is always better." Here's Alexander would continue to do things that confirmed the perception that he was unwilling to fight even a justifiable war, and this would be his undoing. The envoys met with Ardashir and reminded the king of all applicable treaties and territorial claims, and then informed the Sassanids in no uncertain terms that they were encroaching on Roman land and thus risking war. They went on to say that the emperor was more than happy to forget the whole thing, as Ardashir was new to the job and maybe didn't realize what he was doing, but he had to stop his activities right now and stay on the east bank of the Tigris. Ardashir thanked them for their message and told them that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he was going to keep doing what he was doing, and what are the Romans going to do about it if they're so tough. The envoys hastily sent word to Alexander that the Sassanid king had refused to yield, and so Alexander, out of political and moral necessity, mustered an army and prepared to march east. Unlike Lucius Verus, who had taken his sweet time traveling to Antioch the last time the eastern provinces had been under attack, Alexander marched quickly. On his way through Illyria, he drafted a chunk of the Danube legions into his expeditionary force, and, with an impressive army at his back, he arrived in Antioch in 231, ready to begin drilling for the expected campaign. As his army prepared for war, Alexander once again tried for peace. With the Eastern legions strongly reinforced, and the emperor himself present on the scene, Alexander hoped Ardashir would see the error of his ways and back down from the confrontation. But again, though it was probably a prudent overture, the legions were disgusted with Alexander for continuing to jaw when he should be making war. They accused the emperor of being too addicted to the comforts of Rome to defend the empire honorably. I'm willing to give Alexander the benefit of the doubt as to his motivations, but given his later conduct, it's not exactly implausible that the young emperor really was just trying to get out of having to endure the hardships of a military campaign. While he waited for Ardashir's reply, the emperor and his lieutenants struggled to hold the assembled legions together. Discontentment with Alexander's leadership had become second nature to the soldiers, who were annoyed not just with the constant peace offerings, but also with the fact that Julia Mamaea was right there with her son, in his tent, controlling him, and by extension, them. Not only was it bothersome that they were being led by a woman, or a boy being controlled by a woman, which is somehow just a little bit worse, but Julia in particular was not a beloved figure in the army. As I hinted at last week, Julia's conduct eventually became a liability for Alexander, and it was during the Eastern Campaign that this became apparent. The big problem was that Julia Mamaea loved money. Not the things money could buy, but the money itself. She loved money in the way that Ebenezer Scrooge loved money. She loved to acquire it, and she hated to spend it. So while Alexander's regime is often praised for its modesty, in that they didn't spend exorbitant amounts on food and clothes and parties, they often slipped too far the other way and were accused of excessive miserliness, especially by the legions. They had watched their pay cut and their donatives cancelled and every little comfort they had accumulated over the years stripped away, and all the while they had watched Julia Mamaea carefully collect and then sit on tax revenue. The emperor wasn't too broke to pay the legions what they thought they deserved. He was just too stingy. But everyone knew that it wasn't the emperor who was stingy, it was his mother. That lady in the tent over there, she's the one who keeps our rations standard and our camps rough. And she's the same lady who's telling her son to make peace with the Sassanids rather than punish them for their transgressions. No, it is fair to say that the legions didn't like Julia one bit. So Alexander's eastern army was plagued by mutiny. The soldiers coming out of Egypt seemed particularly insubordinate, but the men of the Danube legions were right behind them. They were unused to the Syrian climate, and disease broke out almost as soon as they arrived. Far from home, they began dropping like flies. Supposedly, they were there to fight a war, but instead the emperor was futzing around trying to call the whole thing off, which meant that maybe they had been dragged out to this godforsaken desert for no reason, and now they were maybe dying for no reason. This, as you can imagine, was not a recipe for happy soldiers. So it was perhaps lucky for Alexander that Ardashir again rebuffed his advances. In reply to Alexander's latest peace offering, the Sassanid king demanded that the Romans completely withdraw from their eastern provinces and cede all territory east of the Hellespont to the Sassanids. So yeah, I guess the time had come for war. In 232, Alexander and his generals divided up the legions and set into motion their plan for a three-pronged invasion of Parthian territory. Wait, are we still calling it Parthia? Who is this that we're even fighting these days? One arm was to head north and take the route through Armenia to Media. The second arm would circle around the south and then plunge north, well east of where Ardashir would be expecting an invasion force to appear. The main army, led by the emperor himself, would march through the middle, directly at the heart of the enemy. The point of all this was to divide Ardashir's attention with attacks on multiple fronts, so that he would split his forces, and all three of the Roman arms would enjoy a numerical advantage. It was a great strategy in theory. In practice, it didn't work out quite as planned, especially since Alexander never led the key attack on the middle of Sassanid territory, leaving his two wings exposed to Ardashir's forces. The whole operation got off to a shaky start anyway, though, as the northern trek through the Armenian mountains turned out to be far more difficult than the Romans were anticipating. But after an arduous journey, they emerged from the mountains more or less intact, and immediately besieged the key cities of Media, and it effect on Ardashir, who was compelled to peel off a significant portion of his troops to deal with this crisis in the north. In the south, things went much better for the invading legions, at least at first, and just as planned, they marched north from the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and, much to Ardashir's surprise, the Sassanid king suddenly had to deal with a Roman army deep in his own territory. Leaving behind what he hoped would be enough men in Media, Ardashir rushed east with the rest of his troops to deal with the new front the Romans had opened up. So far, everything was working out exactly as the Romans had hoped. The Sassanid forces were divided and strategically scrambled. All that was left was for Alexander to lead the main Roman army across the Tigris, and the Sassanids would be overwhelmed. But this last crucial step was not taken. It seems that Alexander had come to believe that things were going so well that his part of the plan was now unnecessary. The soldiers under his command, eager to get in the fight, were appalled, and now convinced beyond any doubt that their leader was either a coward or a weakling dominated by a cowardly mother. This decision not to invade would have disastrous consequences. The force marching up from the south believed that the Emperor had already invaded, and thus that their west flank was totally protected. But without Alexander's army getting in the way, Ardashir was able to take a straight line to the unsuspecting legions, and then hit them with a force far in excess of anything they had prepared for. Believing themselves safe on the left, the legions had been sloppy in their defenses, and so when Ardashir appeared on the horizon with a huge Sassanid army behind him, they were taken totally by surprise. Surprise is such a coveted element of war because it so often leads directly to total victory, and in this case, the point was proved decisively. After an improvised attempt to defend themselves failed, the surprised legions were overrun and cut down to the last man. Back in Roman territory, news of the disaster was met with grief and fury by Alexander's army. There was absolutely no reason why their comrades should have been hung out to dry like that. Here they were, the largest of the three divisions, sitting on the sidelines twiddling their thumbs, while out there, men were dying for a lack of support. The damage done to Alexander's reputation was incalculable. But what was done, and the Emperor, realizing that the initial invasion plan was now busted, ordered the northern arm back to Antioch, where the Romans would regroup and reassess their position. But this order only exacerbated the Roman problems, as the march back through Armenia during the winter of 232-233 was even harder than the march in had been. Men died of disease, and exposure, and hunger, and the army that finally arrived back in Antioch was a broken shell of what it had once been. Alexander was spared the painful process of trying to figure out how to salvage victory from the humiliation of defeat, when scouts arrived with the unexpected news that Ardashir had decided to disband his exhausted army. Like the old armies of the Roman Republic, the Sassanid army was an unprofessional force of temporary draftees. Ardashir's running them this way and that over the course of the last few years had led to his own internal problems, as men complained that their farms and businesses were falling into disrepair back home. Rather than risk a full mutiny that would destroy his so recently won legitimacy, Ardashir released them all from service. Besides, it wouldn't hurt to take a few years off to recuperate from this initial encounter with Rome. Ardashir was playing for the long game, and was simultaneously emboldened and chastened by this first war. The next time he took on the Romans, he would be stronger and smarter. The sudden disbanding of the Sassanids was a godsend for Alexander, and it allowed him to extract himself from the east with his dignity somewhat intact. Because at the very least, he would be able to argue that the Romans, despite their setbacks, had actually won the war. But though this line worked on the Senate and the general population, the army wasn't having it for a second. They knew what had really happened, and they were really ticked off about it. Compounding their anger was a message from the west that Germanic tribes had taken the opportunity provided by Alexander's redeployment of the Danube legions to cross the frontier and raid Roman settlements. When the men of the Danube legions found out what had happened, they absolutely redlined. They had been dragged from their homes out to this stupid desert, ravaged